I have spent 4 decades studying the legacy and sharing that of the German pastor theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who you heard a little bit about, who was martyred by the Nazis in April of 1945 for his complicity in the plot of July 20th to assassinate Hitler. Dietrich Bonhoeffer has been throughout my entire professional career a conversation partner, and also, I think, has provided significant inspiration for me, his credible faith, his authentic life, which I'll share just a little of tonight. I was extremely fortunate, in addition to graduate work on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, to become personally acquainted with members of his family and his ministerial colleagues back in the 1970s and 80s. I treasure those times, and especially because out of many of those, only one is still alive, and so those years will remain forever precious memories. I continue to preach at Grace Lutheran Church and teach at Augsburg College and speak around the Minnesota but Twin City area about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and tonight I'd like to share briefly with you, for some who are not acquainted maybe, some of his life and some of that legacy, which would then, I think, deserve what we call honoring or perpetuating maybe that legacy. So now, I'm also remembering the note that the custodian found on the pulpit one Monday morning from the pastor's notes who was preaching. And as the custodian picked up the note, it was a part of the sermon notes, and the little note said, "Weak point in the sermon, pound on the pulpit." I'm hoping we don't have any weak moments coming up now, but I hope to tell you the story of Dietrich Bonhoeffer in sort of a broad brushstroke here. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was born in 1906 into an upper middle class family in Breslau, Germany. It's now Wrocław, Poland. Dietrich's mother, Paula, was of the well-known von Hase family, whose genealogy included many generations of church historians, public leaders. Dietrich Bonhoeffer's father, Karl, was a renowned psychiatrist and neurologist, first in Breslau and then called in 1912 to come to Berlin to the most prestigious chair in Germany. Those fields are at that time consolidated, psychiatry and neurology. He came to Kaiser Wilhelm University, where he also directed the Karate Clinic for Psychiatry. Karl and Paula Bonhoeffer had 8 children, of which Dietrich was one. But starting from the top, I think it's interesting to hear just where those personalities came out. Carl Friedrich was the oldest, born in 1899. He became an atomic physicist, and to this day was successful enough in his career that there is an institute in Hamburg named after him, the Carl Friedrich Bonhoeffer Institute. The second son was Walter, who became a forester, what we would call DNR, I suppose. And he, tragically, was killed only a few days into his military service in World War I. Dietrich's next brother was Klaus, and Klaus was a corporate lawyer with Lufthansa Airlines. His oldest sister then was Ursula. Ursula became married to Rudiger Schleicher, who worked for the German Air Transport Ministry. Christina Bonhoeffer, next daughter, next sibling in line, married Hans von Danani, who was not only a lawyer employed by the Reich Ministry of Justice, but later will become involved and perhaps the intellectual head of the conspiracy to assassinate Hitler. Sabine Bonhoeffer was Dietrich's twin sister, and that got complicated because she married Gerhard Leibholz, who was a Jew. They had to immigrate in 1938 to England, hence avoiding certain death. Sabine and Gerhard were the first of the Bonhoeffers that I came to know in Germany. It was an afternoon in Göttingen. Sabine was then 75 years old, and that afternoon she spent sharing stories of the close relationship she had with her brother Dietrich. Finally, Susanna was the youngest, born in 1909, and she became married later to Walter Dress, who was a theologian in Berlin and one of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's closest friends. 8 children in all, highly educated, exceptionally gifted. In May of 1978, I visited the youngest, Susie Bonhoeffer, in her Berlin home, and I can still remember that she explained why they were dressed in black. I mean, the dress, the sweater, the shoes. On that cloudy afternoon, she shared how April and May, every year as that came around, it was a depressing month for them because it was in that month, April, and then into May, when, of course, they lost their brother Klaus, her brother-in-law Rudiger Schleicher, and, of course, her brother Dietrich, and then brother-in-law Hans von Danani. Suzanne opened up to me in a very touching way her family albums and then explained about the siblings, what those war years were like for their family. Profound and deep feelings of sorrow, but yet also there was a great amount of celebrating just what kind of family she had been given. Her husband, Walter, joined us in the afternoon, and we shared more stories of their life. As I left their home, she gave me the address to contact their son, Andreas, who was actually a godchild of Dietrich. And Andreas was a professor of mathematics in Bielefeld, and it was kind of interesting because about 3-4 months later, he came over then to Minnesota, and he came to the University of Minnesota for a conference in mathematics on crystal formation or something. I couldn't understand it. But he was there, and he stayed with our family for 3 or 4 days. He also shared story after story what it was like growing up during those turbulent war years in a family that was dynamically wired here to be involved in Germany's history. It was into this erudite family that Dietrich Bonhoeffer nurtured a desire, I think modeled after his father Karl and his older brothers, to somehow make a difference in the world. And interestingly, his father and his brothers had no interest in religion. We would call them cautious agnostics. They were scientific type, rational minds who really saw religion as kind of something unnecessary and not important. It was ineffective, which wouldn't be probably all that far off if one looks at the church at that time. And so they critiqued Dietrich's interest when he said he wanted to become a theologian, and said something like that would be kind of an uneventful, useless life. I mean, Dietrich did not have the support of his father and his brothers. The interest in religion came for Bonhoeffer from his mother, who had a deep piety and who, with their Moravian governesses, nurtured the prayer life and observed the holidays, read the scriptures, learned those Bible studies. After completing high school studies in Berlin, Bonhoeffer enrolled at the University of Tübingen, his father's alma mater, to study theology. But after 1 year, he came back to Berlin, where he completed his university study. Indicative of his academic acumen was that he successfully defended his doctoral dissertation at the age of 21, when most of us are finishing our undergraduate studies. He then spent a year as an intern, a vicar in Barcelona, Spain, in a German-speaking congregation there. Came back and then went for a year of postdoctoral study in New York City at Union Theological Seminary. It was during that year in New York City that he had an experience, became involved in the vibrant faith community of the Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem. It was only a few minutes from the seminary. It was during that time that he experienced the virulent white racism in America, which he then later would take back with him and would clearly impact and influence his view, obviously, of German racism toward Jews. While at Union Seminary, Dietrich Bonhoeffer became very good friends with Paul Lehmann, who was also a student at Union, and his wife Marion. In 1982, I was to be in New York City, I don't know what for exactly, but I arranged a visit with the Lehmanns in their New York apartment, and we talked. Paul Lehmann could talk about his conversations with Dietrich Bonhoeffer about theology, and Mary and his wife would talk about those experiences which I think kind of personal anecdotes about their time with Bonhoeffer during that academic year, their impressions and Dietrich's impressions of Depression-era America. Well, on January 30th of 1933, a date you might be acquainted with, German President Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler as Reich Chancellor in hopes of bringing unity and stability to this fragmented post-World War I country that was in such chaos. Now, many, if not most, Germans would see in Hitler this needed hope for a bright future. We know that story, most of us. Dietrich Bonhoeffer's family somehow perceived immediately that what Hitler spoke of would lead Germany into war. And within a very short time, within the first few months of 1933, the Fuhrer would outlaw rival political parties, would put in place the Enabling Act, and start the Aryanization of businesses to force Jews out of Germany. To mention only three of the most probably important events, Bonhoeffer was personally unsure what this was going to mean for church and state with Hitler's assumption of power, so he decided to accept a call to a German-speaking church in England, and so off to London he went. He was there 2 years, but all the while keeping a keen eye on what was going on in Germany. In 1935, Bonhoeffer was called back to Germany from England to direct a preacher's seminary that would be preparing candidates for ordination and service in the anti-Nazi confessing church. The Barmen and Dahlem synods met. The opposition pastors to the German state church had created 5 places, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer was called to direct one of those because of his abilities, of course, his academic preparation as well. This was a very formative time in Bonhoeffer's life as he directed these seminarians who had been through their university studies and now had to spend some months together in a closer community, practicing, learning, reflecting, praying. But with each passing month, the death grip got tighter, if you will, as the Nazi church leaders sought to bring this confessing church into its own domain. By the fall of 1937, less than 2 years later, the confessing church seminaries were closed down. Martin Niemöller, that fiery leader of the confessing church of Berlin-Dahlem, had been imprisoned now, and this then began to be the end of really any resistance that would make a difference, not only in the church, but in the society at large. I want to tell you about one story. In about 1981, one of Bonhoeffer's students, Werner Koch, and his wife Dita came to the Twin Cities. We had him come there to speak about his experience in the confessing church and his time with Dietrich Bonhoeffer. We invited him to speak at colleges and some of the seminaries there. He shared a very interesting story about how serendipitous some of this activity during these difficult times really ended up being. Because he was a journalist after he finished the seminary time, he happened to leak to the press in England and in the United States that Hitler was demanding of people this oath of allegiance. Well, the Nazis watched everything, and soon Werner Koch was imprisoned in Sachsenhausen on the northeast side of Berlin. And the story is this. Werner told us when he was with us in 1981. Werner Koch's father was at a party one night in Berlin with Heinrich Himmler, and the alcohol was flowing rather freely. And Werner Koch's dad went up to Heinrich Himmler and said, "You know, my son's in Sachsenhausen, what can you do to get him out?" And he explained the reason, which he tried to minimize what happened. And I don't know if it was the alcohol or Werner Koch's father's persuasion, but the next day Werner was released from Sachsenhausen because of that happenstance meeting of his father with Heinrich Himmler. I've discovered since that there are so many occasions in lives that were during this chaotic time that somehow, by fortuitous situations, were changed and even saved. Such was one for Werner Koch. It was at this low point in the life of the Confessing Church now, 1937, that Dietrich Bonhoeffer thought about other possible ways to make a difference. Since the church was silenced, he could no longer preach. The Gestapo had their eyes on this pastor in particular. Bonhoeffer searched for ways to possibly end this chaos and offer resistance to Hitler as the country marched on toward war and continental dominance. By 1938, Bonhoeffer was becoming increasingly aware, through his brother-in-law Hans von Danani in the Reich Ministry of Justice, of the plans that were being laid within military intelligence to assassinate Hitler in 1938. In 1940, Bonhoeffer became employed by the Abwehr so that Bonhoeffer could travel to other countries, and outwardly, Bonhoeffer would be speaking positively and trying to foster good relations between the Reich and the other world, but inwardly, what he was doing was sharing with these other countries, England, Switzerland, and in this case through the United States, what the plans were for the military conspiracy to remove Hitler. One such contact was with Bishop George Bell in England, and because of Bonhoeffer's words, George Bell went to the House of Lords and tried to appeal to England that if this conspiracy to assassinate Hitler were to be carried out, that the Allies would assent, the other nations, would affirm those new powers in place, the German officers who would now be creating a new Germany. That was Bonhoeffer's word through England, which ultimately would come to the United States. Had those words been heeded, and had the plot succeeded, several million people would not have perished. The House of Lords echoed what the United States would also have said. We do not want to negotiate with Germany. An absolute, unconditional surrender is all that will be acceptable to us. But that was Bonhoeffer who brought those words and attempted to carry that out. This double life of patriotic agent for the Abwehr, but yet underneath a treasonous conspirator, would continue until April of 1943 when Bonhoeffer was imprisoned in Tegel military prison in northwest Berlin. And then 18 months later, his brother Klaus and his brother-in-law Rudiger Schleicher would be also imprisoned. At the same time that Bonhoeffer was imprisoned, Hans von Danani, his brother-in-law, was imprisoned. That's 4 members of one family, essentially, that now have been put behind bars. Those same 4 would be murdered in the last weeks of 1945, April, when the war was coming to an end. In the summer of 1984, I was traveling in Germany and arranged time to spend with Klaus Bonhoeffer's wife, Emmy. She was in Dusseldorf in her retirement home and still a political activist. She told a very intriguing story, which not only is an intriguing story, but it points out, I think, something about the politics of what was taking place at the time. Emmy Bonhoeffer said one afternoon she went downtown in the local business district. She was in a store, and someone was denying that these Jews were being killed. And Emmy Bonhoeffer now stood up with all that she could muster and said to these people, "No, they are being killed by the tens of thousands." And that person said, "How do you know?" She said, "Believe me, I just know." Well, of course, we know that through her husband and her brother-in-laws, they had an inside track and knew of the atrocities happening in the East. She said she came home to tell Klaus that she was kind of proud of the fact that she had stood up and she had spoken out and given her witness. And her husband Klaus was very upset. Klaus Bonhoeffer said, "That is absolutely ludicrous. You cannot do that." And she's confused because she doesn't know what that means. He said, in a dictatorship like this, we are dealing with a snake. And if you grab a snake by the tail or cut off the tail, it will simply turn and bite you. The only way that this will end is if the head is cut off. And that's what we're doing in the conspiracy. So she took that proud moment, and as she shared it with us, 3 of us with her that day, she said, "This is something that Americans will never understand because you have not lived with that kind of government. You think that if you speak up and you vote, you make your voice known, things will change." This is an interesting example, I thought, firsthand, to learn from someone who lived through that, what that kind of situation would be like. Well, following the unsuccessful plot to kill Hitler, July 20th of 1944, that's what the movie Valkyrie was about, with Tom Cruise, I think. Bonhoeffer was transferred to the maximum security prison of the Prinz-Albrecht-Straße in Berlin, which was the hell of all prisons to have to be in. And it was during that time it became increasingly difficult because as the interrogation intensified, and even the torture, the cross-examinations, with these members of the conspiracy in different prisons, they had to try to keep their stories straight to not implicate others and destroy the plot, which would still be unfolding in some shape outside of the prison. Christoph von Dohnanyi, the son of Hans and Christina, who, by the way, was the director of the Cleveland Orchestra from about 1984 until his retirement, he shared with us one day about how they communicated between prisons. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer was one who took part in this. They still have some of the books. They would request a book, any book, to read, and then when the book came in, they would underline in pencil, starting in the back, one letter under every other page, very lightly. And so it would take them several hours, of course, but they would read backwards, and then this person would know what testimony is being offered in another prison to keep the story straight so that the interrogators couldn't confuse and convict on the basis of conflicting stories. They would then send this book or other books back and forth, and that was a very clever way, you'd say, of communicating to keep things straight. Well, in February of 1945, Bonhoeffer was transferred from Prinz-Albrecht-Straße to Buchenwald, on to Schönberg, Regensburg, ended up in Flossenburg, the place of his eventual execution. Hundreds of people were murdered in the final days of the war as Hitler tried to exact retribution when he found out who really was involved in that conspiracy to end his 1,000-year Reich. Only 2 weeks before the war's end, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, his brother Klaus, his 2 brother-in-laws, Rüdiger Schleicher and Hans von Dohnanyi, all died brutal deaths by summary execution. The camp doctor at Flossenburg, where Bonhoeffer was hanged, it was on a gray Monday morning, April 9th of 1945. Recalled what transpired, and this was his memory a few years after. And I'll have to say, almost every time I read this, I just about don't get through it. But I'll quote. On the morning of that day, between 5 and 6 o'clock, the prisoners, among them Admiral Canaris, General Oster, were taken from their cells, and the verdicts of the court-martial were read out to them. Through the half-open door in one room of the huts, I saw Pastor Bonhoeffer, before taking off his prison garb, kneeling on the floor, praying fervently to his God. I was most deeply moved by the way this lovable man prayed, so devout and so certain that God heard his prayer. At the place of execution, he again said a short prayer, then climbed the steps to the gallows, brave and composed. His death ensued after a few seconds. In the almost 50 years that I worked as a doctor, I hardly have seen a man die so entirely submissive to the will of God." End of quote. What I want to do in the last minutes here, that's his life, that's a sketch. As your program says, I've written a couple books on Bonhoeffer, and for anybody who wants them, I got 200 or 300 copies in my trunk. Okay. No, well, we have a few, but Amazon does much better. But Eberhard Bethge was his closest friend. Later became married into his family. He has written an excellent biography, redone, retranslated with notes in the year 2000, about Bonhoeffer's ministry and his writings and imprisonment. And recently, a 16-volume Dietrich Bonhoeffer Works has come out in English, contains virtually everything extant, everything we know about Bonhoeffer that he wrote and what was written to him. My first time with Eberhard Bethge, Bonhoeffer's closest friend, was in the fall of 1975 at a retreat house in Fitchburg, Massachusetts. 15 of us were gathered for a week where he lectured on Bonhoeffer's legacy. I remember so clearly one afternoon sitting on the end of my bed in the retreat center there, and Bethge came wandering down and sat on the bed next to me, and I had this biography of his on there, and he went through some pages, and there's some pictures in here of things in German, of course, and you can kind of see what they are, but you have to really know the language well, and he wrote in my book, of course, what those words meant, things that he and Dietrich would have talked about, and I remember him saying something, "Dietrich was my best friend." It was during that same week in Fitchburg that one of the afternoons, Bonhoeffer's fiancée, who they never, of course, married, engaged, but then Bonhoeffer was imprisoned. Maria von Wedemeyer was then working for Honeywell in Boston in the IT department. She came over and spent time, and Eberhard told us that this was the first time that she had really heard these things, because after the war, they were so traumatized by all of this that she really didn't have much contact with the Bonhoeffer family. So having her there that afternoon was incredibly meaningful. And that week with Eberhard Bethge in Fitchburg began a long friendship with he and his wife Renata in the years to come. Many times in the Twin Cities they would come for all kinds of reasons. They stayed with us. We had them speak at our churches and the colleges. I will be forever grateful for the time that we spent in that relationship in particular, because one could say without exaggeration, without Eberhard Bethge having brought this story to the world, Dietrich Bonhoeffer's name would have died with the ashes in Flossenburg. Bethge brought that story and that life to us. Let me now give them a couple of concluding thoughts. That's his life, that's his ministry. I would encourage you, obviously, this biography by Bethge is fantastic. My book's okay. First, although I have not spoken in detail here about Bonhoeffer's writings or his theology, his academic offerings, it is the case that Bonhoeffer gifted the world with some of the most incredible Christian theology that we have in the 20th century. From his doctoral dissertation, The Communion of Saints, through Act and Being and Life Together and Discipleship, through his ethics and his letters and papers from prison, his fiction from Tegel, plus all kinds of sermons and prayers. We have in Bonhoeffer a treasure chest of wisdom. I mean, it will be used in inspiring people for generations to come. Bonhoeffer studied under some of the greatest scholars of the early 20th century. Adolf Schlatter and Karl Hall, Adolf Diesmann, Hans Lietzmann, Reinhold Seeberg, Adolf von Harnack, greatest minds in the German scene at that time. He was significantly influenced by the great Reformed theologian Karl Barth. He produced materials which will challenge pastors and theologians and lay people well into the future. His final writings, those snuggled out of prison, letters and papers from prison, where he introduces ideas about the world come of age, the non-religious interpretation of biblical concepts. the church for others. Bonhoeffer is usually known for his heroic sacrifice of life to help free Europe, free Germany from the tyranny of Hitler. Unfortunately, his writings have not, or rarely get the attention, we should say, that they really deserve. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a Christian martyr, no question. Yet even though he died at the young age of 39, he remains one of the 20th century's most stimulating theologians. Second, and now this is where I hope we focus or we get to after we hear about his life. Bonhoeffer's legacy has an incredible amount to offer our world, which is so embroiled in conflicts of race and ideology and even religion. Our world has become so polarized, not for all, but for so many. Northern and southern hemispheres, Christian and Muslim, rich and poor nations, liberal and conservative Christians, citizens, native and European Americans, young and old people, male and female, heterosexual and homosexual, first and third worlds, Arab and Israeli occupants. The list goes on, and I'm clearly aware, as I mentioned those, that I'm listing ones that come to my mind, and I'm missing some other important ones. Diversity and pluralism are so important in realities today, yet they can either be resisted, rejected, or they can be embraced, and we would say celebrated. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a German living in the 1930s, and we could assume that this post-World War I German man would name as his adversaries, get this, the French, the British, the Americans, and the Jews. Ironically, his life experience, but Bonhoeffer's best friends included Jean Lecire from France, George Bell, an English bishop, Paul Lehmann, an American theologian, and Franz Hildebrand, whose mother was Jewish. Bonhoeffer is a role model for his affirmation of others in a world that often will reject those who are different. Dietrich Bonhoeffer ended up dying in an attempt not just to defeat a totalitarian regime, of course, that exalted only Aryans and wished all others destroyed. He lived in a country infected by an ideology of death, yet he boldly affirmed life, especially those who were despised, the handicapped, the mentally ill, the Slavs, the Africans, homosexuals, and most of all despised the Jews. Bonhoeffer crossed all kinds of boundaries that are erected by human beings in the name of this one God of all creation, challenging the Teutonic God of Adolf Hitler. From Bonhoeffer, we can learn and relearn about the sacredness of all of life so that we can not only tolerate our pluralistic world, but we can affirm and celebrate the marvelously diverse humanity created and given to us by God, by Yahweh, by Allah. In July of 1998, my wife Patty and I were invited to be a part of a celebration in London. On the west entrance of Westminster Abbey, they had left vacant 10 niches, and they had decided then, in the 1990s, to put the statues of 12 martyrs of the 20th century. Well, you're going to have, of course, Oscar Romero of El Salvador, Maximilian Kolbe, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Martin Luther King Jr., sort of from every continent, different genders. And because I was then the vice president of this Bonhoeffer Society, we were invited to be a part of that dedication and celebration of worship there. Well, it was grand, the worship and then the unveiling of the statues in London that day. And just humorously, that would be our closest brush that we would come with ever with royalty, for sitting from me to the front pew was Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip, And playing the cello this far over was Dietrich's godson, Dietrich. It was one of those surreal moments, not only for the Bonhoeffer legacy, but for Western civilization, certainly for my life. How was it that Dietrich Bonhoeffer and his family saw beneath the veneer of Nazi propaganda and resisted those superficial promises of Adolf Hitler? How was it that Bonhoeffer was able to worship the God of Israel and all of humanity, resisting the idolization, what you call blood and soil, of only Germany? How was it that he and their family avoided the anti-Semitic racism which infected the minds of most Germans, allowing him to see the image of God in other people? Of course, he wasn't the only one to walk that high road, but he was one of the few. So that we, from him, I think we can set our plumb line, we can map our course. I think by honoring and perpetuating the legacy of someone like Bonhoeffer, although different challenges that he faced, we're given that kind of guidance or direction for the challenges that we face. Now, while anti-Judaism is still a curse to be challenged on all levels, while white supremacist anti-Semites still tragically attack Jewish centers and synagogues, I think that it is today a contempt for Islam and the false images of Muslims that appears to increasingly threaten our global community. Again, different from Bonhoeffer's challenges. Especially after 9/11, it has become incumbent upon us who are not Muslims to educate ourselves about the difference between Islam as a monotheistic faith among the family of world religions that deserves our respect and radical terrorism which abuses and prostitutes the very name of Islam. The witness of Dietrich Bonhoeffer can assist us in this journey of living with others and affirming the divine goodness of all humanity. I've attempted in the 40 years of Christian ministry to help Minnesota Lutherans think outside of Lake Wobegon. And I believe we are making progress. In the realm of interfaith conversation and dialogue, we Christians are at long last coming to believe what Krister Stendahl, Bishop of Stockholm, who often visited Muskegon for interfaith relationships and conversations, Krister Stendahl said beautifully when thinking of our faith and other faiths, "Just because I say my wife is beautiful does not mean that all other women are ugly." I, a white male Christian heterosexual pastor of Anglo descent, am so grateful to be living in 2014 in a world where my historically Scandinavian Lutheran congregation now includes Black Americans, where my associate pastor is female, where my closest teaching colleagues at Augsburg College are Jewish and Muslim, and where a world really where my heterosexual children befriend and defriend gay and lesbian neighbors, and where some of my most trusted friends are Native Americans. This diverse and beautiful reality, to which my life and my vocation here would have been dedicated, to me resembles the kingdom of God for which Dietrich Bonhoeffer gave his life. This is the reality that I think the Torah envisions, that Jesus incarnates, and which the Quran requires. As I followed the interfaith activities of Muskegon from a distance here, I've been impressed with the openness, the depth of respect, and the understanding that exists. This is not happening everywhere. I can assure you of that, but it is happening here. So let me bring this around. People tell me, "Pastor, the best part of your sermon are the words 'in conclusion.'" So here we go. My life journey, which began in the early morning of November 19th, 1949, at Hackley Hospital, has taken me through Bunker Junior High School in Denmark Street and Lakeside, and to Muskegon Senior High School on Southern Avenue, from the lunchroom of Muskegon Community College to the lecture halls of Concordia College and Luther Seminary in St. Paul, and on to the International Center for Holocaust Studies in Jerusalem. I have been blessed with the incredible opportunities many don't have for education and travel, the loving support of family, and a time in history when monumental strides are being made in the realm of human justice and global reconciliation. I said earlier that Dietrich Bonhoeffer was my conversation partner. That's true professionally, and that his reflections and writings have deeply influenced the way that I have worked as a pastor. Yet, even more profoundly, Bonhoeffer has been a conversation soul partner. I've discovered early on that I shared so many of his life questions and convictions, and in every chapter and every turn, he's been my theological mentor and faith partner. It would not be an exaggeration to say that Dietrich Bonhoeffer has been my link to Jesus, much as Jesus might be your link to God. Let me end with two experiences now that will bookend this experience and maybe this presentation. One bookend or memory goes back to 1967. I can still remember myself sitting at a lunch table in Muskegon's newly constructed college on Coeur d'Alene Road. This was when it opened. We called it JC, Muskegon County Community College. I remember talking with my friend Randy Grossman about Western Civilization class. We were both taking it from Jack Rice. Randy Grossman, a young Jewish man whose father owned one of Muskegon's department store, or grandfather. Randy Grossman was informing me about Martin Luther's anti-Judaic diatribes from the 16th century. He knew more than I, a kid from our Saviors, about some of Luther's vitriolic words that had been used by the Nazis to stigmatize Jews and finally contribute to the Holocaust. I felt ashamed at that time that as a Lutheran boy, I had never heard those parts of Luther's legacy. We did hear, and we all know that Luther had marvelous things to say about grace, goodness, and God. We know that. But not only did I find my education then about Lutheranism take flight, but also Judaism. I came to learn that Jesus the Jew, and that everything in my faith tradition somehow wrapped back around, that I was a Jew not by blood, but by faith and theology. Now come with me 27 years later, second final bookmark. I was asked by my bishop in 1990 to become a member of the newly formed Consultative Panel for Lutheran Jewish Relations. It was a bishop from Baltimore, Frank Sherman from Chicago, and this pastor from Minneapolis. Consultative Panel for Lutheran Jewish Relations of the newly formed Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the ELCA. 4 years later, I was sitting around a conference table, and we were co-authoring an ELCA Lutheran statement to the Jewish community, a statement that included contrition and repudiation for those words of Luther, which my friend Randy Grossman had told me about earlier. The statement which we crafted in 1994, and which the Jewish community received with unbelievable gratitude, is now part of the permanent display on anti-Semitism in the United States Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. The statement stands as a historic symbol of repentance and reconciliation. We are making progress, but what we need are authentic and courageous witnesses for dialogue, justice, and reconciliation, such as Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and I would add you and me, because so much still needs to be done. Hopefully the legacy of Dietrich Bonhoeffer can serve to inspire you and me, and as the name and generosity of Charles H. Hackley, in whose memory this evening is dedicated. Thank you for your presence tonight, the Friends of the Hackley Public Library, for bestowing this honor. I am deeply grateful. Amen.